Hey guys, tonight we are wrapping ourselves in a metaphorical woolen cloak and stepping back into a time when the world outside was often cold, chaotic, and frankly, quite terrifying. Imagine, if you will, a landscape of rough roads, unpredictable weather, and even more unpredictable people. But amidst this turbulence, there existed islands of surprising peace, order, and yes, even coziness. We're journeying to the heart of the medieval monastery. Now, when you think medieval monastery, you might picture stern-faced monks, endless chanting in drafty halls, and a life of grim deprivation. And while there was certainly devotion and discipline, tonight we're peeling back the heavy oak door to find the surprisingly warm, well-ordered, and dare I say, comfortable aspects of monastic life. But let's be real, if you were suddenly thrust into the actual medieval period outside those monastery walls, with its charming lack of sanitation, questionable food safety, and the ever-present threat of plague or a random Viking deciding your village looked like a good spot for a fiery makeover, you probably won't survive this. Seriously, the average life expectancy was not exactly encouraging. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It genuinely helps these little historical explorations reach more people like us. And, as always, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your corner of the world, so drop that in the comments below. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The biting wind whips your already threadbare cloak tighter around you, a poor defense against the pre-dawn chill that seems to seep into your very bones. For days, perhaps weeks, you've been on the road, each step a weary effort on paths that are more mud-track than thoroughfare. The world outside the dream you're seeking is a relentless grind of uncertainty. Feudal lords squabble, bandits roam the wilder stretches of woodland, and disease can fell a village with terrifying speed. Shelter is often a leaky barn or the cold comfort of a forest floor, with only the rustling of unseen creatures for company. And believe me, medieval squirrels were probably not above judging your snoring. Your stomach rumbles with a familiar emptiness, the last stale crust of bread a distant memory. But then, through the mist that clings to the low hills, you see it. At first, just a darker shape against the gray, but as you draw nearer, it resolves into solid, reassuring stone walls, perhaps the glint of a leaded window catching the first weak rays of the rising sun, or the sturdy silhouette of a bell tower reaching towards the heavens. This is your destination, the monastery of St. Swithin's Humbug, or St. Gregory's Glorious Groceries, or whatever suitably pious and slightly quirky name it bears. It rises from the landscape not as a threatening fortress, but as a promise of order, a beacon of stability in a decidedly unstable world. You're not entirely sure what drives you here. Perhaps it's a genuine spiritual calling, a deep yearning for a life dedicated to God, far from the temptations and tribulations of secular existence. Or maybe, just maybe, the thought of regular meals, a roof that doesn't leak, and a life free from the constant threat of being conscripted into someone's private war holds a certain appeal. Historians still argue whether the primary motivation for entering a monastery was purely spiritual devotion or if social and economic factors, such as seeking refuge, education, or a structured life for younger sons or unmarried daughters, played an equally significant role for many. For you, right now, as you stand shivering and exhausted, the reasons are probably a messy, hopeful jumble. The last stretch of road leading to the main gate seems to drag on forever, each footfall heavy with a mixture of trepidation and desperate hope. What if they turn you away? What if this sanctuary is just another illusion? The sounds of the outside world, the distant howl of a wolf, the creak of a peasant's cart, seem to fade as you approach, replaced by a different kind of sound, or perhaps, a different kind of silence. You might hear the faint, distant sound of chanting, a low, resonant hum that speaks of ancient rituals and unwavering routine. Or perhaps just the cawing of rooks in the ancient trees that shelter the monastery walls. Finally, you stand before the great wooden gate, studded with iron, imposing yet not overtly hostile. There's likely a smaller postern gate for everyday visitors, and perhaps a grille through which you can speak to the gatekeeper or porter. This monk has a crucial role. The Rule of Saint Benedict, a foundational text for Western monasticism, instructs that the porter should be a wise old man, who knows how to receive and to give an answer, and whose ripeness of age will not suffer him to wander. He is, in essence, the monastery's first line of welcome and defense. You hope he's had his morning gruel and is feeling charitable. Taking a deep breath, you reach for the iron ring of the knocker, or perhaps call out, your voice raspy from disuse and the cold air. The sound echoes, seemingly swallowed by the thick stone. A tense moment passes. Then, a small shutter slides open in the grille, and a pair of eyes peer out. They are not unkind, perhaps just weary, or appraising. You stammer out your request: shelter, a chance to speak to the abbot, a desire to what? To leave the harshness behind. One quirky tidbit from monastic life is the existence of specific rules and rituals for how guests should be received. Saint Benedict emphasized hospitality, stating that all guests should be received as Christ himself. This didn't mean an instant open-door policy for absolutely everyone without question, but it did mean that genuine seekers of shelter or spiritual guidance were generally treated with respect and care, at least initially. No vacancy signs here usually. The gatekeeper might ask you a few questions, his voice muffled through the wood. Your purpose? Your origins? He's assessing whether you're a genuine pilgrim, a desperate soul seeking refuge, or perhaps just a wandering minstrel hoping for a free meal and a warm bed by exaggerating your piety. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen from our far distant medieval beekeeper tales? Well, the gatekeeper has probably heard equally outlandish stories from travelers, so a bit of discernment is necessary. If your plea is deemed sincere, or at least not immediately suspicious, there's a clanking of bolts, a groaning of hinges, and the small postern gate creaks open. You step across the threshold, and it's like entering another world. The air within the monastery walls seems calmer, the lights softer. The raw, untamed chaos of the outside is replaced by the ordered lines of buildings, the neatness of a courtyard, perhaps the scent of baking bread or herbs from a nearby garden. Even the sounds are different, the distant clang of a smithy, the cooing of doves, the murmur of voices engaged in quiet work, all underpinned by that sense of structured peace. This is it. Your first tentative step into the surprisingly cozy and utterly transformative world of the medieval monastery. The wind still howls outside those thick walls, but here, in this haven of stone and prayer, a different kind of dawn is breaking for you, one that promises not just survival, but perhaps even a measure of warmth, purpose, and gentle awakening. The heavy postern gate closes behind you with a solid, reassuring thud, the sound momentarily muffling the wind that still howls beyond the monastery's protective embrace. You find yourself standing in an outer courtyard, perhaps a little dusty from the comings and goings of supply carts or lay workers, but a world away from the perilous uncertainty of the road. The gatekeeper monk, having ushered you in, might now lead you towards a guest house or a small receiving room, his movements unhurried, his simple woolen habit swishing softly with each step. You, still feeling the grime and weariness of your journey, probably feel a bit like a muddy stray brought into a very clean house. Your immediate needs, warmth, food, a moment to catch your breath, will likely be attended to with a quiet efficiency that speaks of long practice. The rule of Saint Benedict, which governed the lives of countless monks and nuns across medieval Europe, places great emphasis on hospitality, as we mentioned, stating, "Let all guests who arrive be received like Christ, for he is going to say, 'I was a stranger, and you welcomed me.'" This wasn't just a nice sentiment, it was a foundational principle. So, you might be offered a cup of weak ale or some watered wine, a hunk of bread, perhaps even some pottage if it's near a mealtime. It's simple fare, but to your famished self, it tastes like a banquet. Once you've recovered a little, and if your intention is indeed to explore the possibility of joining this community, you'll eventually be brought before the abbot, or abbess, if it's a nunnery. This is the spiritual head of the monastery, a figure of immense authority but also, ideally, of great wisdom and compassion. Your first interview will be a crucial one. The abbot will want to understand your motivations. Are you truly seeking God? Are you running from something, or towards something? Are you prepared for a life of obedience, prayer, and manual labor? He or she has seen many hopefuls, and many who weren't cut out for the demanding, yet rewarding, monastic life. There's no one-click join button here. If the abbot deems you a potentially suitable candidate, you won't be immediately welcomed into the fold with open arms and a freshly laundered habit. Oh no, the path to becoming a fully fledged monk or nun is a carefully structured, and often lengthy, probationary period. This is the novitiate, a time of testing, learning, and discernment, both for you and for the community. It's surprisingly like a very long, very pious job interview, where your CV is your soul and the references are from a higher power. You would begin as a postulant, perhaps for a few days or weeks, living within the monastery, observing the life, and undertaking simple tasks. This is a chance for you to get a real taste of what you're signing up for, and for the monks to see if you can handle the routine. Do you flinch at the pre-dawn call to prayer? Do you grumble about the simple food? Do you get into arguments with Brother Cuthbert about whose turn it is to scrub the refectory floor? These are important data points. If you persevere through this initial stage and still wish to continue, you would then be formally admitted as a novice. This is a more structured period of training, typically lasting at least a year, under the guidance of a novice master. The novice master was a key figure, responsible for instructing novices in the rule, the traditions of the monastery, the rudiments of Latin, if you didn't already know it, as the services and much of the reading would be in Latin, and the complex cycle of prayers and chants that made up the divine office, or Opus Dei, work of God. He would also observe your character, your temperament, and your suitability for the communal life. It's a bit like spiritual boot camp, but with more chanting and less shouting, usually. Life as a novice would be a period of intense learning and adjustment. You'd be gradually introduced to the full monastic routine, the 8 daily services, starting with vigils or matins in the very early hours of the morning, often around 2 or 3 a.m., and continuing throughout the day with lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and finally compline before bed. You'd learn the psalms, the hymns, the responses. You'd practice silence at designated times and in designated places, like the cloister or the refectory during meals. One quirky aspect of monastic communication during periods of silence was the development of elaborate sign languages. Different monasteries often had their own unique gestural vocabularies for conveying essential messages, from asking for more bread to indicating that a particular book was needed from the library. Imagine trying to explain, "The inkwell is empty and a mouse just ran off with my quill," using only hand gestures. You would also participate in manual labor alongside the professed monks, perhaps working in the gardens, the kitchens, the bakery, or helping in the scriptorium. This wasn't just about getting the chores done. It was an integral part of the Benedictine ethos of ora et labora, pray and work. Humility and a willingness to serve were highly valued. Historians still argue whether the novitiate was primarily a period of spiritual formation or a practical screening process to weed out those who were unsuited or insincere. It was likely a combination of both. The demands were significant, and not everyone made it through. Some novices would realize that the monastic life, for all its potential comforts of stability and routine, was not for them and would choose to leave. This was generally permitted without disgrace during the novitiate. It was better to discern your true calling, or lack thereof, before taking lifelong vows. Throughout this time, you'd be living a life stripped of many worldly comforts and distractions, but also filled with a new sense of purpose and belonging. The structured days, the shared work, the beauty of the liturgy, the quiet support of the community, these could be profoundly comforting, especially after the chaos and uncertainty of the world you left behind. You are learning a new rhythm, a new language, a new way of being. The novice's steps are indeed hesitant at first, as you stumble over Latin phrases or feel an overwhelming urge to nap during the afternoon psalms. But with each passing day, if this life truly resonates with your soul, those steps become a little more confident, a little more aligned with the ancient, peaceful pulse of the monastery. And the thought of those drafty barns and stale bread on the outside? Suddenly, a bit less appealing than a warm bowl of monastic pottage, even if it means getting up at 2 a.m. Assuming you've navigated the challenging, yet supportive, path of the novitiate, and both you and the community feel that this is indeed your true calling, the day will arrive for you to make your solemn profession. This is the moment you formally commit yourself to the monastic life, taking vows that will shape your existence from that day forward. And with these vows comes a new identity, symbolized most visibly by the monastic habit, that distinctive, often simple, but deeply meaningful attire that you will wear for the rest of your days within these walls. Far from being merely a uniform of deprivation, the habit and the vows it represents offer a surprising degree of comfort, both practical and spiritual. The ceremony of profession itself would be a deeply significant and often moving event. You would, in the presence of the abbot, the community, and perhaps even some select lay guests, publicly declare your intention to renounce the world and dedicate your life to God. The core vows, as laid out in the Rule of Saint Benedict, are typically three: stability, conversion of life, or conversational morum, and obedience. Stability meant committing yourself to remain in that particular monastery for life, not flitting from one community to another. Conversion of life was a broader commitment to ongoing spiritual growth, to strive for perfection according to the monastic way, embracing poverty and chastity as part of that transformation. Obedience, crucially, meant submitting your will to that of the abbot, who was seen as representing Christ within the community, and to the rule itself. These aren't exactly terms you'd find in a modern employment contract. Must be willing to relinquish all personal ambition and follow direct orders from a man in a frock for the rest of your natural life. Dental plan not included. After making your vows, often written out and signed by your own hand and placed upon the altar, you would be clothed in the full monastic habit. This was a powerful symbolic moment. The shedding of your secular clothes and the donning of the habit signified your death to your old life and your rebirth into this new, consecrated existence. The habit itself, while varying slightly in color and style between different monastic orders, Benedictines often wore black, Cistercians white or undyed wool, for example, generally consisted of several key garments. First, there would be the tunic, a long, loose-fitting garment, usually of wool, often undyed or in a sober color. This was your basic everyday wear. Over this, for warmth, or for liturgical services, you might wear a scapular, a long, sleeveless piece of cloth that hung down front and back, originally a kind of work apron but evolving into a symbolic monastic garment. Then there was the cowl, a long, hooded cloak, also typically of wool, which provided significant warmth and was especially worn in choir during the long hours of prayer services, or when outdoors in cold weather. The hood could be pulled up to cover the head, offering protection from drafts and also a sense of enclosure and focus during prayer. Some orders also had a separate hood or cap. The quality of the wool and the construction of these garments were designed for durability and practicality rather than fashion. They needed to withstand daily wear, manual labor, and the often chilly medieval climate. The perceived comfort of these garments is, of course, relative to the alternatives of the time. For a peasant used to a single, rough-spun tunic, the layers of woolen monastic clothing, regularly laundered, monasteries often had surprisingly sophisticated laundry systems for the era, would have felt like a significant step up in terms of warmth and hygiene. One quirky detail is that monks were typically issued with multiple sets of undergarments, breeches and shirts, often of linen, and outer habits, so that they could always have clean clothes while others were being washed. This was a level of cleanliness not always achievable in secular life. No more turning your only tunic inside out for a fresh look. Beyond the physical comfort, there was a profound psychological comfort in the habit. It was a clear marker of your identity and your belonging to the community. It removed the distractions of worldly fashion and the anxieties of choosing what to wear. Everyone was dressed similarly, fostering a sense of equality and shared purpose. The habit was also a constant reminder of your vows and your commitment. It was, in a sense, a wearable prayer. The vows themselves, while sounding restrictive to a modern ear, could also be a source of great liberation and comfort. The vow of poverty, for example, meant renouncing personal possessions. While this might seem harsh, it also freed you from the burdens of material acquisition, the anxieties of wealth and poverty that plagued the outside world. The monastery provided for all your basic needs. food, clothing, shelter. You own nothing, but you also lack nothing essential. Historians still argue whether the corporate wealth of some monasteries sat uneasily with the individual poverty of the monks. But for the individual monk, the vow of poverty could simplify life immensely. The vow of chastity meant renouncing marriage and sexual activity. In an age where marriage was often an economic or dynastic arrangement, and where childbirth was perilous, remember those Georgian childbirth terrors? Medieval ones were no picnic either. A life of celibacy could offer a different kind of freedom, allowing for a focus on spiritual and intellectual pursuits without the responsibilities and potential heartaches of family life. And the vow of obedience, while requiring submission to the abbot and the rule, also provided a clear framework for life. It removed the burden of constant decision-making in many areas, allowing for a focused pursuit of spiritual goals within a well-defined structure. The Rule of Saint Benedict, far from being a tyrannical document, was actually designed to create a balanced and sustainable way of life, with allowances for human weakness and an emphasis on communal harmony. So, as you stand newly professed, feeling the unfamiliar weight and warmth of your woolen habit, you are enveloped not just in cloth, but in a new way of being. The world outside, with its fleeting fashions and precarious freedoms, recedes further. Here, within these walls, clothed in the simple dignity of your order, and bound by vows that offer a different kind of security, you find a surprising comfort in the structure, the simplicity, and the shared identity of your new monastic family. Your old, tattered cloak has been replaced by something far more enduring. Having been clothed in the comforting wool of your habit, and bound by vows that paradoxically offer a new kind of freedom, you now fully immerse yourself in the daily rhythm of the monastery. And that rhythm, more than anything else, is dictated by the bells. From the first deep toll that rouses you from sleep in the inky blackness long before dawn, to the final gentle chime that signals the end of Compline and the descent of the great silence, the monastic day is punctuated, ordered, and even soothed by the sound of bells and the sacred duty of chant. This is not a life of random actions, but a divinely choreographed dance, a timeless pattern that brings a profound, and surprisingly cozy, sense of predictability and peace. The core of this monastic timetable is the Opus Dei, or Work of God, the 8 daily prayer services, also known as the Divine Office or the Liturgy of the Hours. These services, spaced throughout the day and night, are when the community gathers in the monastery, church, or oratory to chant the psalms, sing hymns, listen to readings from Scripture and the Church Fathers, and offer collective prayer. This wasn't a burden to be endured. It was the very heart of monastic life, the primary reason for the monastery's existence. It was seen as the monks' most important work, an offering of praise and supplication on behalf of themselves, the wider church, and indeed, the whole world. Your day begins incredibly early. The first bell for vigils, or matins, might ring around 2 o'clock or 3 a.m. You rouse yourself from the dormitory, more on that cozy shared slumber later, perhaps splashing cold water on your face from a communal basin, and make your way through the dark, silent cloister to the church. The air in the church is cool, perhaps a little damp, lit by flickering oil lamps or beeswax candles. Remember the importance of beeswax from our beekeeping tales? The service of vigils is long, consisting of many psalms, readings, and responses, all chanted. The sound of the unified voices, male or female depending on the monastery, filling the shadowy space, can be incredibly powerful and moving, even in your half-awake state. It's a profound act of communal devotion performed while the rest of the world sleeps. A short while later, as the first hint of dawn begins to gray the eastern sky, the bell rings for lauds, the morning prayer of praise. This service is generally more joyful and uplifting than vigils. Then, as the sun fully rises, comes prime, around 6 a.m., after which the day's manual labor or intellectual work typically begins. Throughout the working day, the bells continue to call you back to prayer. Terce, around 9 a.m., Sext, around noon, and None, around 3 p.m., are shorter services, often called the Little Hours, providing regular pauses in your work for recollection and renewed prayer. It's like a divinely mandated coffee break, only with psalms instead of caffeine. These regular interruptions ensure that, No matter what practical tasks you were engaged in, whether copying a manuscript in the scriptorium, weeding the garden, or baking bread in the kitchen, your focus was continually brought back to the spiritual purpose of your life. As evening approaches, the community gathers for Vespers, one of the most important and often most beautiful services of the day, corresponding to the Jewish evening sacrifice. The psalms and hymns at Vespers are often particularly poignant. Finally, before retiring for the night, there is Compline, the last prayer of the day. This is a quiet, reflective service, often including prayers for protection through the night. After Compline, the Great Silence begins, a period of profound quiet that lasts until after prime the next morning, during which no unnecessary talking is permitted. This silence fosters an atmosphere of peace and contemplation, allowing for private prayer and rest. Learning the chants, particularly the complex system of Gregorian chant used for the psalms and hymns, would have been a significant part of your training as a novice. Gregorian chant, with its flowing, monophonic melodies, was developed to enhance the sacred texts and create an atmosphere of prayerful solemnity. It wasn't about performance or individual virtuosity, but about unified, prayerful utterance. A quirky tidbit is that some monasteries developed incredibly sophisticated systems of musical notation, neumes, to record these chants, which were crucial for preserving and transmitting this vast repertoire of sacred music. The cantor or choir master would be responsible for leading the chant and teaching it to new members. The sound of a well-trained monastic choir, their voices blending in the resonant acoustics of a stone church, could be an experience of sublime beauty and spiritual uplift. Historians still argue about the exact timing of these services and the level of participation by all monks in every single office, especially in larger monasteries where some monks might have specialized duties that took them away from the church. However, the basic framework of the Opus Dei was universal, providing a consistent and predictable structure to each and every day. This unvarying rhythm, this constant return to prayer and chant, might sound monotonous to a modern mind accustomed to constant novelty and stimulation. But for you, the medieval monk or nun, it is the very bedrock of your existence. There is a deep comfort in this predictability. You always know what comes next. The world outside might be chaotic and unpredictable, but within these walls, the bells toll with unwavering regularity, the ancient words of the Psalms are sung as they have been for centuries, and the community moves together in a shared rhythm of devotion. This timeless pattern, far from being oppressive, creates a sense of stability, peace, and profound spiritual coziness. It's a routine that holds you, sustains you, and gently guides you through your days and years, all under the watchful, comforting sound of the monastery bells. Between the sacred duties of the Opus Dei, with its soul-stirring chants and the comforting toll of the bells, another vital and surprisingly cozy form of work of God takes place within the monastery walls, often in a room specifically designed for quiet concentration, the scriptorium. Here, amidst the scent of ink, parchment, and beeswax, you might find yourself engaged in the painstaking, yet deeply satisfying, task of copying manuscripts. This isn't just about preserving knowledge, it's an act of devotion, a quiet battle against the darkness of ignorance, and a surprisingly warm and focused way to spend your working hours. The scriptorium, which literally means a place for writing, was a common feature in many medieval monasteries, especially those with a scholarly bent or a tradition of learning, like Benedictine or Cistercian houses. Before the invention of the printing press in the 15th century, every book had to be copied by hand, making monasteries crucial centers for the preservation and transmission of classical learning, biblical texts, and the writings of the Church Fathers. Without the diligent work of monastic scribes, a vast amount of ancient and medieval literature would simply have been lost to time. It's like they were the original human photocopiers, only with much better handwriting and a significantly higher chance of developing back problems. If you were deemed to have the necessary skills, good eyesight, a steady hand, patience, and a decent understanding of Latin, you might be assigned to work in the scriptorium. This room was often located on the sunny side of the cloister, to maximize natural light, and sometimes had individual carrels or desks for each scribe. While we often imagine medieval interiors as universally drafty and cold, scriptoria were sometimes among the warmer rooms in a monastery, as a certain level of warmth was necessary to keep the ink flowing and the scribe's fingers from stiffening up too much. A small brazier might be allowed in colder weather, though fire was always a significant risk in a place filled with precious, flammable manuscripts. Some monasteries even developed underfloor heating systems, hypocausts, a Roman technology that was occasionally revived. Your workday in the scriptorium would be governed by the same bells that called you to prayer, with periods of intense focused work interspersed with the services in the church. You would be provided with your materials, a carefully prepared sheet of parchment, made from animal skin, usually sheep or calf, scraped and smoothed, vellum being the finest quality from calfskin, or, later in the period, paper, though parchment remained the standard for important works. You'd have a quill pen, likely made from a goose or swan feather, which you need to sharpen regularly with a small knife, a penknife, literally. Your ink, often made from oak galls, producing a dark brownish-black ink, or lampblack, soot, would be in a small horn or pot. You might also have colored inks, especially red minium, from which we get the term miniature, for illustrations, for headings, initials, or corrections. The process of copying was slow and meticulous. You'd have an exemplar, the manuscript you were copying from, propped up beside you. You'd carefully rule faint lines on your parchment to guide your writing, ensuring straight, even text. Then, letter by letter, word by word, you would transfer the text, trying to replicate the script of the exemplar as accurately as possible. Different scripts were used at different times and for different purposes, from the formal uncial and Carolingian minuscule to the more compressed Gothic scripts. A quirky tidbit is that scribes often developed their own abbreviations and shorthand to save space. Parchment was expensive, and time, which can make deciphering medieval manuscripts a challenge for modern scholars. Mistakes were inevitable. If you made an error, you might carefully scrape it off the parchment with your knife, another use for the penknife, or mark it for correction by a senior scribe or corrector. Scribes often left little notes in the margins of manuscripts, sometimes complaining about the cold, the poor quality of the parchment, their aching backs, or even a troublesome fly. These marginalia provide fascinating, human glimpses into their daily lives. "This parchment is hairy," one might grumble, or, "My hand is freezing." It's like the medieval equivalent of a frustrated tweet about your office conditions. For more important manuscripts, the work didn't stop with just the text. Illuminators, highly skilled artists, often monks themselves, but sometimes lay craftsmen, would add decorative initials, borders, and miniature paintings to embellish the text. This was incredibly detailed and painstaking work, using gold leaf, silver, and vibrant pigments made from ground minerals or plants. The results could be breathtakingly beautiful, transforming a simple book into a precious work of art, a true treasure for the monastery library. The atmosphere in the scriptorium would be one of intense, focused silence, broken only by the scratching of quills, the rustle of parchment, and perhaps the occasional whispered consultation. This quiet concentration was conducive to the work, but it also fostered a contemplative state. Copying sacred texts was seen as a form of prayer, a way of meditating on the words as you wrote them. It was a deeply spiritual as well as an intellectual and artistic endeavor. Historians still argue about the level of literacy and intellectual engagement among all monks who worked as scribes. While some were undoubtedly profound scholars who understood deeply what they were copying, others may have been skilled copyists who were more focused on the mechanics of accurate transcription than on the theological nuances of the text. Regardless, their collective labor was immense and invaluable. The scriptorium was, in its own way, a surprisingly cozy place. Not necessarily in terms of roaring fires, too dangerous, but in the warmth of shared purpose, the quiet dignity of the work, and the deep satisfaction of contributing to something lasting and beautiful. As you hunch over your desk, your quill moving steadily across the page, the scent of ink and parchment filling your nostrils, you are part of a vital chain of knowledge, a guardian of words against the ravages of time. And in the gentle rhythm of your work, punctuated by the call to prayer, you find a unique kind of peace, a focused tranquility that is as warming to the soul as any hearth fire. The light you are helping to preserve is not just the light of learning, but a gentle, steady glow within the monastery's heart. Emerging from the focused quiet of the scriptorium, blinking in the brighter light, you might find yourself stepping into one of the most serene and, yes, surprisingly cozy spaces within the monastery's embrace, the cloister garden. This wasn't just a decorative patch of green, it was a vital, multifunctional area, often situated in the open square enclosed by the covered walkways of the cloister, and it served as a physic garden for medicinal herbs, a kitchen garden for fresh produce, a place for quiet contemplation, and sometimes even a burial ground for the brethren. It was, quite literally, a green sanctuary at the heart of monastic life, a fragrant haven of peace and practical sustenance. The cloister itself, those covered arcades surrounding the central garth or garden, was a key architectural feature of most monasteries. It provided a sheltered walkway connecting the main buildings, the church, the chapter house, where the community met for business and disciplinary matters, the refectory, dining hall, and the dormitory. It was a place for monks to walk, read, meditate, or engage in quiet tasks, protected from the elements, but still open to the air and light filtering in from the garden. The rhythmic repetition of the arches and columns created a sense of order and peace, a perfect space for mindful perambulation. You might see Brother Thomas slowly pacing, his lips moving in silent prayer, or Sister Agnes sitting on a stone bench, mending a habit, the scent of herbs wafting in from the nearby beds. The garden within the cloister garth was often laid out in a formal, geometric pattern, perhaps with a well or fountain at its center, symbolizing the waters of life. This design reflected the medieval love of order and symbolism. But its beauty was more than just aesthetic, it was deeply practical. A significant portion of this garden would be dedicated to the physic garden, also known as the herb garden or herbularius. Here, the infirmary, the monk or nun in charge of the sick bay, more on that later, or a specially designated herbalist would cultivate a wide array of medicinal plants. Monasteries were crucial repositories of herbal knowledge, drawing on classical texts from authors like Dioscorides and Pliny, as well as accumulated folk wisdom. You'd find neat beds of familiar, and perhaps some less familiar herbs. Lavender, rosemary, thyme, and sage, valued for their aromatic and antiseptic properties, would almost certainly be there. Chamomile for calming, peppermint for digestion, comfort for healing wounds and bones. Its old name was nid-bone, valerian for sleep, and feverfew for headaches and fevers. Horehound for coughs, plantain for drawing out splinters, and calendula, pot marigold, for skin inflammations. The infirmary would carefully harvest these herbs, dry them, and prepare them into infusions, decoctions, ointments, and powders to treat the ailments of the brethren and sometimes even people from the surrounding lay community. One quirky, and rather essential, herb often grown was rue, which was believed to ward off plague and other pestilences, and was also used as an insecticide and to keep away snakes, or so they hoped. It had a very strong, pungent aroma. Remember that Georgian obsession with metallic poisons? Here, the pharmacy was literally growing outside your window, offering a generally gentler, if not always effective, approach. Adjacent to the physic garden, or perhaps in a larger, separate walled garden area, would be the kitchen garden. This was vital for supplementing the monastic diet with fresh vegetables and fruits. You'd see rows of onions, leeks, garlic, the medieval flavor power trio, cabbages, turnips, parsnips, carrots, though likely the paler, less sweet varieties than modern ones, peas, and beans. Apple, pear, and plum trees might line the walls or grow in a small orchard. Berries like raspberries and currants would also be cultivated. Having fresh produce readily available was a significant advantage, contributing to a healthier and more varied diet than was often possible for people in the secular world, especially the poor. It also reduced the monastery's reliance on outside markets. Historians still argue about the extent to which monastic diets were truly austere or if, especially in larger and wealthier monasteries, they enjoyed a surprisingly diverse and abundant food supply thanks to their well-managed gardens and estates. The care of these gardens was part of the labora, the manual work expected of the monks. You might spend your designated work hours weeding, watering, planting, or harvesting, under the direction of the gardener monk. This work was not seen as demeaning. It was considered a vital contribution to the community's well-being and a way to connect with God's creation. The fresh air, the scent of the earth, the satisfaction of nurturing growing things. It could be a deeply grounding and peaceful activity, a welcome contrast to the intense focus of the scriptorium or the long hours in choir. There's a certain cozy satisfaction in seeing the fruits and vegetables of your labor. The cloister garden wasn't just about utility. It was also a place of beauty and spiritual symbolism. Flowers were often grown alongside the herbs and vegetables: roses, symbolic of the Virgin Mary and martyrdom; lilies, purity; violets, humility; and columbines, the Holy Spirit. The enclosed nature of the garden, the hortus conclusus, was itself a powerful symbol of paradise, of the Virgin Mary, or of the contemplative soul protected from the distractions of the world. Walking in the garden, surrounded by the fragrance of herbs and flowers, the gentle hum of bees — monasteries often kept bees, as we know, for honey and vital beeswax — and the peaceful architecture of the cloister could be a deeply restorative and spiritual experience. It was a space where the practical and the profound, the earthly and the divine, met in a harmonious and surprisingly cozy blend. It was a little patch of Eden, carefully tended, right in the heart of your stone-walled sanctuary. From the fragrant peace of the cloister garden, or perhaps after a period of focused labor in the scriptorium or the fields, the monastery bells will eventually summon you to another essential and surprisingly comforting ritual of the communal day: the meal in the refectory. This isn't a hurried, grab-and-go affair like a modern lunch break, nor is it a boisterous, feasting hall scene from a medieval romance. Instead, monastic dining is a structured, orderly, and often silent experience, designed to nourish not just the body but also the soul, reinforcing the bonds of community and the principles of moderation and gratitude. The refectory, or dining hall, was typically a large, long room, often situated on one side of the cloister, conveniently close to the kitchen. It would be furnished with long wooden tables and benches, simple but sturdy. At one end, there might be a raised dais for the abbot and any important guests, and often, a prominent crucifix or a painting depicting the Last Supper would adorn the wall, a constant reminder of the spiritual context of the meal. The refectory, like the church, was considered a sacred space, and a certain decorum was expected. You wouldn't be throwing food or engaging in loud banter here. This wasn't your local medieval alehouse. As the bell for the meal rings, typically for the main meal around midday, sext, and a lighter supper in the evening, after Vespers, though the exact timing and number of meals could vary by order and season, you and your brothers, or sisters, file into the refectory in an orderly fashion, usually in procession, perhaps ranked by seniority. You take your assigned place at the table. Before any food is touched, grace is said or chanted, a prayer of thanks for the sustenance provided. This act of gratitude sets the tone for the entire meal. The food itself, served by designated monks, often those whose week it was to serve in the kitchen and refectory, a rotating duty that fostered humility, would be simple but generally wholesome and sufficient. The rule of Saint Benedict advocates for moderation, typically allowing for 2 cooked dishes at the main meal to provide variety, and ensure everyone had something they could eat, along with bread and wine, or ale. Meat from 4-footed animals was generally forbidden for monks in good health, though poultry and fish were often permitted, especially on feast days or for the sick in the infirmary. The staple of the monastic diet was often a thick vegetable pottage or stew, made with grains, like barley or oats, and whatever vegetables were in season from the kitchen garden: onions, leeks, cabbage, turnips, peas, beans. Remember all that hard work in the hortus alatorius? This is where it pays off. Fresh bread, baked daily in the monastery's own bakehouse, was a crucial part of every meal. Fruit from the orchard might also be served in season. One of the most distinctive features of monastic dining was the practice of silence. During meals, conversation was usually forbidden. This wasn't intended as a punishment, but rather to encourage mindfulness, prevent idle chatter, and allow for another form of spiritual nourishment: the reading aloud of sacred texts. While the community ate, one monk, designated as the reader for the week, would stand at a lectern and read from the Bible, the lives of the saints, or other devotional works. This practice, known as table reading or Lectio Divina at meals, ensured that even while eating, the monks' minds were focused on spiritual matters. It also meant that even illiterate monks could absorb these important texts. Imagine trying to eat your soup quietly while someone is intoning a particularly dramatic passage from the Book of Revelations. It certainly adds a certain gravitas to dinner. To communicate essential needs during the silent meal. Pass the salt, more bread please. The monks would use that elaborate system of sign language we mentioned earlier. Pointing, nodding, and specific hand gestures would convey messages without breaking the sacred silence. It's like a very polite, very pious game of charades. A quirky detail of refectory life was the mixtum, a small extra allowance of bread and wine sometimes permitted outside of main mealtimes, particularly for monks who were elderly, infirm, or engaged in particularly strenuous labor. This acknowledged that the strict rules might need a little flexibility to accommodate human needs. The abbot had the discretion to grant such allowances. The quality and quantity of food could vary significantly depending on the wealth and resources of the particular monastery, the region, and the time of year. Some well-endowed monasteries became known for their rather generous interpretation of moderation, especially on feast days, when richer dishes, more meat, and better quality wine might appear on the tables. Historians still argue about the extent to which the monastic diet was genuinely austere versus being, in some cases, more plentiful and varied than that of the average peasant outside the walls. Certainly, the regularity of meals and the access to produce from their own gardens and farms meant that monks were generally better fed and less prone to famine than much of the secular population. After the meal, another prayer of thanks would be offered. The monks would then file out in an orderly manner, and those rostered for cleanup duty would set about clearing the tables and sweeping the floor. The whole process was a model of efficiency and decorum. There's a surprising comfort to be found in this ritualized, silent sustenance. The predictability of the meals, the shared experience of dining as a community, the spiritual nourishment of the table reading, and even the discipline of silence, all contribute to a sense of peace and order. You are not scrambling for scraps or worrying about where your next meal will come from. You are provided for. The simple, wholesome food, often grown and prepared by the hands of your own brothers, tastes all the better for the shared labor and the atmosphere of quiet gratitude. In the refectory, you are fed not just in body, but in spirit, finding a unique kind of cozy communion in the breaking of bread and the attentive listening to sacred words. And you probably develop an excellent ability to eat soup without slurping. Having been nourished in body and spirit by the orderly and silent meal in the refectory, your attention might now be drawn to the source of that sustenance, the monastery kitchen and its associated industries, like the bakehouse and brewery. Far from being a place of meager rations and grim toil, the medieval monastery kitchen was often a surprisingly bustling, well-organized, and even creative hub, a place where practical skills were honed, and where the bounty of the monastery's lands was transformed into the daily bread, pottage, and ale that sustained the community. There's a particular kind of cozy warmth to be found near a well-tended hearth, especially when it promises a hearty loaf or a comforting brew. The monastery kitchen would typically be a substantial stone building, often located near the refectory for ease of serving, but sometimes slightly detached to reduce the risk of fire spreading to other essential buildings like the church or library. It would be dominated by a large central hearth or several fireplaces, with spits for roasting, though meat was limited. Fish or poultry might be roasted on special occasions, and large cauldrons suspended over the flames for making the ubiquitous pottages, soups, and stews. The air would be thick with the smells of wood smoke, simmering vegetables, baking bread, and perhaps the sweet scent of herbs or spices, if the monastery was well off enough to afford them. It's a far cry from the often smoky, one-room hovels where many peasants cooked. Here, there was space, dedicated equipment, and a system. The monks assigned to kitchen duty, the kitcheners, often working on a weekly rota system, would be responsible for preparing the meals for the entire community. This was no small task, especially in a large monastery with dozens or even hundreds of monks, plus any guests or lay workers. They would need to be skilled in managing the fires, preparing vegetables from the garden. Remember all those onions, leeks, and cabbages? Making pottage, and perhaps cooking fish if it was on the menu. Fish was a particularly important food source, especially on Fridays and during Lent when meat was forbidden. Monasteries often had their own fish ponds, carefully stocked and managed, to ensure a fresh supply. Smoked or salted fish, purchased from outside, would also be common. The bakehouse, or castorium, was another vital and wonderfully fragrant part of the monastic food operation. Here, the baker monks would produce the daily supply of bread, the absolute staple of the medieval diet. They would use flour milled from grain grown on the monastery's own estates, or purchased, and yeast often saved from the brewing process, a nice bit of monastic recycling. Large ovens, built of brick or stone, would be fired up, and the comforting smell of baking bread would permeate the air. Different types of bread might be made: finer white bread for the abbot, important guests, or the sick in the infirmary, and coarser, darker bread, often made with rye or barley as well as wheat, for the general community. The daily provision of fresh, wholesome bread was a significant aspect of the monastery's ability to provide for its members. No stale crust here, usually. And then there was the brewhouse, or brasinum, ale, and sometimes beer if hops were used, which became more common later in the medieval period, was the everyday drink for most people in medieval Europe, including monks. Water sources were often unreliable or unsafe to drink untreated, whereas the brewing process, involving boiling, made ale a safer and more nutritious option. Monasteries were renowned for the quality of their ale, and some monastic orders, like the Cistercians and later the Trappists, became particularly famous for their brewing skills. The brewer monk would be a highly skilled individual, overseeing the malting of grain, usually barley, the mashing, boiling with herbs, like gruit, a traditional mixture of herbs, before hops became widespread, or hops, and the fermentation process using carefully guarded strains of yeast. Large wooden tuns and barrels would fill the brewhouse. The monastery would need to produce a significant quantity of ale to supply the community daily. A quirky detail is that different strengths of ale were often brewed: a strong ale for feast days or important guests, a good table ale for the monks, and a weaker, small beer that was less alcoholic and perhaps given to children or used for general hydration. The warmth from the brewing coppers and the malty, hoppy aromas, if hops were used, would make the brewhouse a surprisingly cozy place, especially on a cold day. And the end product certainly contributed to a certain internal coziness for the monks. Historians still argue about the exact quantities of food and drink consumed per monk, as records can be interpreted in different ways. But it's generally agreed that monastic communities, especially the larger and better endowed ones, had a more secure and often more varied food supply than much of the lay population. They benefited from large-scale agriculture on their estates, well-managed gardens, fish ponds, and the organized labor of the community. The kitchen, bakehouse, and brewhouse were not just places of toil. They were also places of skill, tradition, and even a certain artistry. The ability to produce good food and drink consistently for a large community required considerable knowledge and organization. There was a pride in this work, a satisfaction in providing for one's brothers. The warmth of the hearths, the comforting smells, the rhythmic work of kneading dough or stirring a bubbling cauldron, these created an atmosphere of productive, earthy coziness that was a vital counterpoint to the more ethereal activities of the church, or the scriptorium. It was here that the monastery's connection to the land and its ability to sustain itself became most tangible, a daily miracle of transformation from raw ingredients to nourishing sustenance. All thanks to the diligent hands and practical wisdom of the monastic cooks, bakers, and brewers. And the unspoken promise of a warm slice of bread or a comforting mug of ale after a long day. That's a kind of cozy you can almost taste. As the day draws to a close, after the final prayers of Compline have been sung and the great silence descends upon the monastery, you make your way with the rest of the community to the dormitory, or dorter. This is where you will spend the night, not in a private, solitary cell, but in a large communal sleeping chamber. While the idea of sleeping in a room with dozens of your brethren might not immediately scream cozy to a modern sensibility that prizes privacy, In the context of the medieval world, the monastic dormitory offered a surprising degree of security, warmth, and a unique form of communal comfort. The dormitory was typically a long, spacious room, often located on the upper floor of one of the main claustral buildings, sometimes directly above the warming house, a room with a communal fire, one of the few heated spaces in many monasteries, to benefit from any rising heat. Its size would, of course, depend on the number of monks in the community, but dormitories could be very large indeed, housing scores, or even over 100, individuals in some of the bigger abbeys. The room would be lined with individual beds or sleeping spaces. These weren't luxurious four-poster beds with feather mattresses. Monastic simplicity generally dictated more austere arrangements. Each monk would likely have a straw-filled pallet or mattress, a palliasse, perhaps laid on a simple wooden bedstead or within a partitioned cubicle for a modicum of privacy, though often they were more open. You'd have a woolen blanket or two, and perhaps a pillow stuffed with straw or feathers. Compared to the often cold, damp, and insecure sleeping conditions faced by many people in the secular world, huddling on the floor of a peasant hut or a traveler's inn of dubious cleanliness, the monastic dormitory, while basic, was a significant improvement. One of the key aspects contributing to the coziness of the dormitory was shared warmth. In an era before central heating, the collective body heat of many individuals sleeping in one large room would have made a noticeable difference to the ambient temperature, especially during cold medieval winters. This, combined with the thick stone walls of the monastery and the woolen blankets, would have created a sleeping environment that was considerably warmer and more sheltered than many could expect outside. Remember those drafty castles or peasant hovels? The dormitory, by comparison, was a communal incubator. Security was another major factor. Sleeping alone in the medieval world, especially if you were vulnerable or traveling, could be a risky business. Within the monastery walls, and particularly within the locked and supervised dormitory, you were safe from bandits, wild animals, and the general uncertainties of the night. The rule of Saint Benedict specified that a candle should be kept burning in the dormitory all night, and that the monks should sleep clothed in their habits, or at least their tunics and belts, ready to rise for the night office of vigils. This constant preparedness, and the presence of the entire community fostered a deep sense of security. There's a certain comfort in knowing you're not alone in the dark, especially when the dark could hold very real terrors. The communal nature of the dormitory also reinforced the bonds of brotherhood, or sisterhood. While the great silence was observed, meaning no talking, the simple act of sleeping in the same space, rising together for prayer, and sharing the rhythms of night and day, created a powerful sense of shared experience and mutual support. You were not isolated in your spiritual journey. You were surrounded by others engaged in the same pursuit. This could be incredibly comforting, especially for those who had left behind families or felt adrift in the secular world. It's like a perpetual, very quiet, very pious slumber party. A quirky detail of dormitory life, particularly in some stricter orders, was the presence of the circuitor or circuitor, a monk whose duty it was to patrol the monastery, including the dormitory, during the night and at other times to ensure that the rule was being observed. This might involve checking that monks were not sleeping too soundly and missing the call to vigils, or that silence was being maintained. While this might sound a bit like having a prefect in a very serious boarding school, it was part of the structure that maintained order and discipline, which in turn contributed to the overall sense of a well-regulated and therefore secure environment. Historians still argue about the level of actual comfort and privacy in monastic dormitories. While some depictions show individual cells or well-partitioned cubicles, others suggest more open-plan arrangements. The quality of bedding and the general conditions would also have varied considerably between different monasteries and over time. However, compared to the often harsh realities of medieval life outside, the dormitory offered a predictable, safe, and relatively warm place to rest. So, as you lie on your straw pallet, the sound of your brother's gentle breathing around you, and hopefully not too much snoring from brother snoring, and hopefully not too much snoring from brother Eustace in the next cubicle, the faint light of the continuously burning candle flickering on the stone walls, you are enveloped in a unique kind of communal peace. The wind may be howling outside, the world may be full of uncertainties, but here, within the shared slumber of the dormitory, under the watchful care of your community and your God, you can rest with a sense of security and belonging that is, in its own way, deeply and surprisingly cozy. It's a far cry from a luxurious feather bed, but in the medieval calculus of comfort, it was a haven indeed. When the bells for prime have rung, signaling the end of the great silence and the true beginning of the monastery's working day, you won't be heading off to a medieval equivalent of an office cubicle or a factory floor. Instead, you'll likely be engaging in labora, manual labor, a core tenet of the Benedictine rule and a fundamental aspect of monastic life. Far from being seen as demeaning or a mere necessity, this work was imbued with dignity, considered a form of prayer, and a vital contribution to the community's self-sufficiency. Whether you find yourself in the fields, the workshops, or tending to the monastery's infrastructure, there's a surprising satisfaction and even a cozy camaraderie to be found in the shared rhythms of honest toil. The principle of ora et labora, pray and work, was central to Saint Benedict's vision for monasticism. He believed that idleness is the enemy of the soul, and therefore monks should be occupied at specific times in manual labor, and at others in sacred reading. This balance was intended to keep both body and spirit healthy and focused. The type of manual labor undertaken would vary greatly depending on the location and resources of the monastery, as well as the skills of its members. However, agriculture was a common and essential form of monastic work, especially for monasteries situated in rural areas with extensive land holdings. You might find yourself heading out to the monastery's fields, known as the Grange, after the morning services. Here, alongside your brothers and perhaps some lay workers employed by the monastery, you would engage in the seasonal tasks of farming. In spring, it would be plowing and sowing, perhaps with a heavy ox-drawn plow, or tilling the soil with hoes and spades. Summer would bring the weeding and tending of crops like wheat, barley, oats, or rye. Autumn was the busiest time, the harvest season, when everyone would be involved in reaping the grain with sickles, binding it into sheaves, and bringing it back to the monastery's great barns. The development of new agricultural techniques, such as the three-field crop rotation system and the use of the heavy-wheeled plow, was significantly advanced by some monastic orders, particularly the Cistercians, who were renowned for their farming expertise and their ability to turn marginal lands into productive estates. They were, in a way, the agricultural innovators of their time. This wasn't just about subsistence. It was about efficient land management. The work was hard, no doubt. Your back would ache from bending, your hands would blister from gripping tools, and you'd be exposed to the sun in summer and the cold in winter. But there was also a deep satisfaction in it. You were working in rhythm with the seasons, directly connected to the land that sustained you. The shared effort, the camaraderie of working alongside your brethren, singing psalms or hymns as you toiled, could make even the most arduous tasks feel lighter. And the sight of a field of golden grain, ready for harvest, representing food and security for the community, would be a profoundly rewarding one. Beyond the fields, there were many other forms of manual labor within the monastery walls. You might be assigned to the mill, grinding the harvested grain into flour, or to the bakehouse, kneading dough and tending the ovens, as we've discussed. Perhaps your skills lay in carpentry, masonry, or blacksmithing, and you would work in the monastery's workshops, repairing buildings, making tools, or shoeing horses. Monasteries aimed for a high degree of self-sufficiency, so having skilled craftsmen within the community was invaluable. Imagine the cozy glow of the blacksmith's forge on a chilly morning, the rhythmic clang of hammer on anvil, a sound of productive industry. Animal husbandry was another important area. Monasteries kept livestock, cattle for milk, meat for guests or the sick, if not for healthy monks, and draft power, sheep for wool, a major source of income for some orders, like the Cistercians in England, and parchment, pigs for meat, and poultry for eggs and meat. Tending to these animals, feeding, mucking out, milking, would be part of the daily routine for some monks. Remember our medieval beekeeper? Many monasteries also kept bees for honey, a vital sweetener, and beeswax, for those essential church candles. Even seemingly mundane tasks like laundry, cleaning, mending clothes, or fetching water and firewood were considered part of labora, to be undertaken with diligence and humility. A quirky aspect of monastic labor is that tasks were often rotated, or assigned based on a monk's abilities and the needs of the community, rather than on personal preference or status. The monk who was a brilliant illuminator in the scriptorium one week might be assigned to weeding the turnip patch the next. This fostered a sense of equality, and prevented anyone from becoming too proud of their particular skill. Historians still argue about the precise economic impact of monastic labor on the wider medieval economy. While some see monasteries primarily as spiritual centers, others emphasize their role as significant economic engines, managing large estates, pioneering agricultural techniques, and producing goods for trade. The truth is likely a complex mixture of both. The dignity of this work lay in its purpose. It wasn't undertaken for personal gain, but for the glory of God and the common good of the community. It was a way of participating in God's creation, of transforming the raw materials of the earth into sustenance and utility. There was an honesty and a directness to it that could be deeply fulfilling. As you wipe the sweat from your brow after a morning spent scything hay, or admire a neatly stacked pile of firewood you've chopped, there's a sense of tangible accomplishment, a feeling of having contributed something real and valuable. This shared purpose, this productive rhythm, created its own kind of warmth, a cozy satisfaction that came not from idleness, but from the diligent work of your hands, offered up in service and in prayer. While the rhythmic cycle of prayer and work kept most of the monastic community healthy in body and spirit, illness and injury were, of course, inevitable realities in medieval life, even within the relatively sheltered confines of the monastery. However, unlike many in the secular world who might have to rely on folk remedies of dubious efficacy or the often harsh interventions of a traveling barber surgeon, you, as a member of a monastic community, would have access to a dedicated space and system for care, the infirmary. This monastic sick bay, run by an infirmary monk or nun, was often a surprisingly advanced center of healing for its time, blending practical nursing, herbal lore, and a compassionate approach that offered a gentle, cozy haven for the ailing. The infirmary, or farmary, was typically a separate building, or a distinct wing, within the monastery precinct, often situated a little apart from the main hustle and bustle to ensure peace and quiet for the sick. It would usually have its own chapel, so that bedridden monks could still participate in some form of the liturgy, and sometimes its own kitchen, as the sick often required a special diet different from the main refectory fare. The main infirmary hall might be a long room, similar to the dormitory but perhaps smaller, with individual beds or cubicles for the patients. Crucially, it was often one of the better heated and more comfortable parts of the monastery, with a dedicated fireplace or braziers to keep the patients warm, recognizing that warmth was essential for recovery. Remember those drafty castles? The infirmary aimed to be a pocket of warmth. The monk or nun in charge of the infirmary, the infirmerer, was a key figure. This individual was expected to be not only skilled in basic medical knowledge and the preparation of herbal remedies but also patient, compassionate, and dedicated to the care of their sick brethren. The rule of Saint Benedict is very clear on this. Before all things and above all things, care must be taken of the sick, so that they may be served in very deed as Christ himself. This directive infused monastic healthcare with a profound sense of spiritual duty. The sick weren't seen as a burden, but as an opportunity to practice Christian charity and compassion. The medical knowledge available to the infirmer would have been a blend of classical learning, texts by Galen, Hippocrates, and Dioscorides, often preserved and copied in the monastery's own scriptorium, extensive herbal lore, and practical experience. We've already visited the physic garden, the source of many of the infirmary's remedies. The infirmer would be adept at recognizing, harvesting, and preparing these medicinal plants, making infusions for fevers, poultices for wounds and swellings, salves for skin conditions, and syrups for coughs. While some of these remedies might seem quaint or ineffective by modern standards, many traditional herbal treatments did have genuine, if mild, therapeutic properties. And they were certainly less aggressive than the heroic bleeding and purging often favored by secular physicians of the time, or the metallic poisons we encountered in our Georgian journey. Basic nursing care was also a crucial part of the infirmary's function. This would include keeping patients clean, comfortable, and well-nourished. The diet in the infirmary was often more liberal than in the main refectory. For example, meat, which was generally restricted for healthy monks, was usually permitted for the sick to help them regain their strength. Broths, eggs, milk, and other easily digestible foods would be provided. The infirmarier and their assistants, perhaps other monks assigned to help, or novices gaining experience, would tend to the patient's needs, changing dressings, administering remedies, and offering comfort and companionship. While major surgery was generally beyond the scope of most monastic infirmaries, complex cases might be referred to a secular surgeon, or a surgeon might be called into the monastery. Infirmariers would have been skilled in treating wounds, setting simple fractures, lancing boils, and perhaps even performing minor procedures like bloodletting, though this was often done with more moderation than in the outside world. A quirky, and rather practical, skill for an infirmarier would have been dentistry, at least for tooth extractions, as toothache was a common medieval complaint. They might use herbal preparations to numb the gum, or a simple pair of pincers for the extraction, hopefully with a gentler hand than the marketplace tooth drawer. Historians still argue about the extent to which monastic infirmaries contributed to the development of medical science versus simply preserving existing knowledge. While they were not typically centers of radical medical innovation in the way universities later became, their emphasis on careful observation, record-keeping, some infirmaries kept patient records, and the systematic cultivation and use of medicinal herbs certainly played a vital role in maintaining and transmitting medical learning through the often turbulent medieval centuries. They also fostered an ethos of compassionate care that was not always evident in the more commercially driven medical practices outside. Beyond caring for their own community, many monastic infirmaries also extended their services to the local lay population, especially the poor who had no other access to medical care. This charitable function was an important way in which monasteries served the wider society, offering a beacon of hope and healing. A peasant with a festering wound or a child with a fever might be brought to the monastery gate seeking the help of the infirmarier. So if you fell ill within the monastery walls, you would be moved to the infirmary, a place of relative quiet and comfort. Here, you would be tended with gentle hands, offered soothing herbal remedies, and nourished with special food. The atmosphere would be one of care and concern, underpinned by a deep spiritual conviction. It was a far cry from the often terrifying and impersonal experience of illness in the wider medieval world. In the monastic infirmary, you weren't just a collection of symptoms to be aggressively treated. You were a soul to be nurtured, a brother to be cared for, in a space designed to be as cozy and conducive to healing as medieval knowledge and resources allowed. It was a surprisingly gentle haven in a harsh world. Having experienced the quiet care of the infirmary, or perhaps just seeking a moment's respite from the rigors of a long journey, you might find yourself encountering another surprisingly cozy and vital aspect of monastic life: the guest house. Monasteries, particularly those situated along pilgrimage routes or major thoroughfares, were renowned for their hospitality. The rule of Saint Benedict, as we've noted, placed a profound emphasis on welcoming strangers, seeing Christ in every guest. This wasn't just a theoretical ideal. It was a practical, well-organized system for providing shelter, food, and comfort to weary travelers, making the monastery a veritable beacon of warmth and welcome in a world where safe and reliable lodging could be hard to find. The guest house, or hospitium, was typically located in the outer precincts of the monastery, near the main gate, sometimes separate from the main claustral buildings to minimize disruption to the monks' contemplative life while still allowing for easy access for visitors. It could range from a simple hostel with a few basic rooms to a quite substantial and well-appointed building, depending on the size, wealth, and importance of the monastery. Some larger abbeys had multiple guest houses, perhaps one for wealthier or more distinguished visitors, like bishops or nobles, and another for poorer pilgrims or ordinary travelers. The monk in charge of the guest house, the guest master or hospitaller, played a crucial role, similar in some ways to the gatekeeper. He was responsible for receiving guests, ensuring their needs were met, and generally overseeing the smooth running of the guest house. Like the infirmary, the guest master was expected to be a man of great charity, patience, and discretion. He would greet new arrivals, perhaps wash their feet, a symbolic act of humility and welcome, echoing Christ washing the feet of his disciples, and assign them a place to sleep. The accommodation offered would vary. In a basic guest house, you might find yourself in a communal dormitory, similar to the monk's order but perhaps a bit less austere, with straw pallets or simple beds. Wealthier guests might be given private rooms, sometimes with their own fireplaces and more comfortable furnishings. Cleanliness was generally maintained, and fresh linen would be provided, a significant luxury compared to the often dubious hygiene of secular inns. Remember how our medieval beekeeper probably slept on a lumpy straw sack? The monastery guest house aimed for a higher standard. Food was, of course, a key part of monastic hospitality. Guests were typically fed in the guest house itself, or sometimes, if they were of high rank, they might be invited to dine with the abbot in his private lodgings. The fare would generally be simpler than what the monks themselves might eat on a feast day, but it would be wholesome and plentiful. You could expect bread, ale, pottage, and perhaps some cheese or eggs. The guest master would ensure that no traveler went hungry. This reliable provision of food was a huge draw for pilgrims and other wayfarers who might otherwise struggle to find sustenance on the road. It was the medieval equivalent of a really good, free bed and breakfast, minus the TripAdvisor reviews, though word-of-mouth reputation was incredibly important. The length of stay permitted would vary. Most monasteries offered hospitality for a night or two free of charge. For longer stays, a contribution towards expenses might be expected, especially from wealthier guests. However, genuine pilgrims or those in dire need were often sheltered for as long as necessary. This open-handed charity was a hallmark of monastic life. A quirky aspect of guest house life was the interaction, or sometimes lack thereof, between the guests and the monastic community. While guests were treated with kindness, their presence was not supposed to unduly disturb the monks' routine of prayer and work. Separate facilities and carefully managed access helped to maintain this balance. However, guests would often be invited to attend services in the monastery church, offering them spiritual solace as well as physical comfort. For many travelers, experiencing the beauty and solemnity of monastic worship would have been a profound and memorable part of their stay. Historians still argue about the economic impact of monastic hospitality. While it was a significant charitable undertaking, it also brought benefits to the monastery. Grateful guests, especially wealthy ones, might make donations or leave bequests. The presence of pilgrims and travelers also fostered connections with the outside world, bringing news and sometimes even new recruits. Furthermore, providing reliable lodging could stimulate local trade and enhance the monastery's reputation and influence in the region. The guest house wasn't just for itinerant strangers. It also served as a place where relatives of the monks might stay when visiting, or where patrons and benefactors of the monastery could be accommodated. This maintained important social and economic ties. So, as you, a weary traveler, are welcomed into the monastic guest house, perhaps your muddy boots removed and your tired feet washed by the guest master, you are experiencing a remarkable institution of medieval charity and warmth. The simple bed might feel like a cloud after nights spent on the hard ground. The plain food might taste like a feast to your empty stomach. And the sense of safety and peace within these walls, after the uncertainties of the road, would be profoundly comforting. The monastery guest house was more than just a building. It was an embodiment of a core Christian value, a practical expression of compassion that offered a surprisingly cozy and restorative haven for countless souls navigating the often harsh realities of the medieval world. It was a place where, for a little while at least, you could lay down your burdens and be truly welcomed as Christ himself. Beyond the immediate, tangible comforts of a warm bed in the guest house or a nourishing meal in the refectory, the medieval monastery offered another, perhaps more profound, kind of coziness for those with a scholarly or contemplative bent, the library. In an age when books were precious, handwritten treasures, painstakingly produced and often incredibly rare, the monastic library was a sanctuary of learning, a repository of ancient wisdom, and a place where the quiet thrill of intellectual discovery could be experienced. before you, as a monk with a love for letters, or even as a privileged guest with access, the library's hushed atmosphere and its shelves laden with knowledge represented a unique and deeply comforting haven. The monastic library, or armarium, originally meaning a cupboard or chest where scrolls were kept, but later referring to the library room itself, was not typically the vast, multi-story public institution we imagine today. In earlier medieval monasteries, books might simply be stored in chests or cupboards in the cloister, near the church, or in the chapter house. As collections grew, dedicated library rooms became more common, though they were often still relatively modest in size compared to the grand libraries of later periods or universities. The emphasis was on careful preservation and controlled access, rather than on lending books out freely. Remember how much effort went into creating just one manuscript in the scriptorium? These weren't paperbacks you'd casually toss in a bag. The atmosphere within the library would be one of profound quiet and scholarly reverence. Light would be carefully managed, enough for reading, but not so much direct sunlight that it would damage the precious parchment and inks. Windows might be fitted with horn, oiled linen, or, in wealthier establishments, glass, which was still an expensive commodity. Dust, the enemy of books, would be kept at bay as much as possible. The scent of old parchment, leather bindings, and perhaps a hint of beeswax polish would permeate the air, a perfume instantly recognizable to any lover of old books. It's the medieval equivalent of that new, or very old, book smell that makes bibliophiles swoon. The books themselves would be stored on shelves, pludii, in presses, locked cupboards, or sometimes chained to lecterns or desks to prevent theft, a practice known as cadenati libraries. This might sound extreme, but given the immense value of each individual manuscript, representing weeks, months, or even years of skilled labor, security was paramount. Each book was a significant investment, both in terms of materials and the scribe's time. Losing one would be a serious blow. What kind of books would you find on these shelves? The core of any monastic library would be religious texts. Multiple copies of the Bible, the Vulgate, St. Jerome's Latin translation, psalters, missals, for celebrating Mass, lectionaries, collections of readings for services, and antiphonaries, chant books, were essential for the daily life of worship. Writings of the Church Fathers, Augustine, Jerome, Ambrose, Gregory the Great, would be well represented, providing theological guidance and commentary. Lives of the Saints, hagiographies, offered models of piety and inspiration. But monastic libraries often contain much more than just theological works. Many preserved classical Latin texts, works by Virgil, Ovid, Cicero, Seneca, Horace, which were studied for their language, rhetoric, and sometimes, despite their pagan origins, for the moral lessons that could be extracted from them. Treatises on grammar, logic, and rhetoric, the trivium of classical education, would be available for study. There might also be works on medicine, like those of Galen or Hippocrates, vital for the infirmary, astronomy, mathematics, music theory, essential for understanding chant, and history, like Bede's Ecclesiastical History of the English People. Some monasteries even had chronicles detailing the history of their own foundation and important local events. It was a surprisingly diverse collection, a window onto the intellectual landscape of the medieval world. Access to the library would typically be restricted. Not every monk could simply wander in and browse the shelves at will. The librarian, or armarius, was responsible for the care and custody of the books. Monks who needed to consult specific texts for their studies, for preparing sermons, for teaching in the monastic school, if one existed, or for their work in the scriptorium, would request them from the librarian. Books might be loaned out for use within the monastery, often against a careful record. Loaning books outside the monastery was a much rarer and more carefully controlled affair, usually only to other trusted religious houses or very important individuals, and often requiring a substantial pledge or security. For those granted the privilege of reading in the library, it would be a deeply immersive and comforting experience. You might sit at a simple wooden desk or lectern, the heavy manuscript open before you, its pages filled with elegant script and perhaps vibrant illuminations. The silence would be broken only by the rustle of turning pages or the distant chime of the monastery bells. Here you could commune with minds from centuries past, delve into complex theological arguments, marvel at the beauty of classical poetry, or trace the intricate patterns of an illuminated initial. A quirky and relatable experience for any scholar would be the frustration of finding that the specific passage you needed was in a manuscript currently being used by Brother Cuthbert, who was a notoriously slow reader. Historians still argue about the general level of literacy and intellectual activity within all monasteries. While some were renowned centers of scholarship, producing brilliant theologians and chroniclers, others may have been more focused on prayer and manual labor, with more limited library collections and less emphasis on academic pursuits. However, even in less scholarly houses, the presence of books, especially the sacred scriptures, was a powerful symbol of the monastery's connection to a tradition of learning and divine revelation. The monastic library was more than just a storeroom for books. It was a powerhouse of intellectual and spiritual energy. It was a place where the past was preserved, the present was enriched, and the future, in terms of knowledge transmission, was secured. For you, as a medieval monk with a thirst for knowledge, the library was a sanctuary within a sanctuary, a cozy haven of vellum and ink, where the whispers of ancient wisdom offered profound comfort and endless fascination. It was where the mind could take flight, even as the body remained enclosed within the monastery's peaceful walls. Beyond the intellectual nourishment of the library and the focused labor of the scriptorium, the medieval monastery was also a place where beauty was cultivated and expressed, not for its own sake, but as an offering to God and an aid to devotion. This artistic expression took many forms, from the sublime harmonies of chant and the intricate craftsmanship of liturgical objects, to the vibrant colors of illuminated manuscripts and the very architecture of the monastery buildings themselves. For you, living within these walls, the daily encounter with this purposeful beauty, this striving for heavenly harmony in earthly forms, would have been a profoundly uplifting and surprisingly cozy aspect of your monastic life, a constant reminder of the divine order and splendor. The most pervasive form of artistic expression was, of course, the liturgical chant, which we've already touched upon. The hours spent in choir, your voice blending with those of your brethren in the ancient melodies of Gregorian chant, was a daily immersion in a world of disciplined, ethereal beauty. This wasn't just singing, it was sung prayer. The carefully structured melodies, the subtle nuances of rhythm and intonation, were all designed to elevate the sacred texts, to carry them into the hearts of both the singers and any listeners, like guests in the church. The skill involved in performing this complex repertoire well was considerable, requiring years of training under the cantor. The resulting sound, filling the resonant space of the stone church, could create an atmosphere of profound peace and spiritual elevation, a truly heavenly harmony that wrapped around you like a warm cloak. It's the original ASMR, designed to soothe the soul and lift the spirit. Music beyond plain chant also had its place, though its use varied between different orders and periods. While some stricter orders, like the Cistercians in their early days, eschewed more elaborate polyphony, music with multiple independent melodic lines, and instrumental music in church, fearing it might be too distracting or worldly, other traditions, particularly in larger cathedrals and wealthier abbeys, embraced more complex musical forms. The development of polyphony was, in fact, significantly advanced in some monastic and cathedral schools. Organs, though initially quite primitive, began to appear in some monastery churches from around the 10th century onwards, adding a new dimension of sound to the liturgy. If your monastery had a skilled organist and a choir capable of singing polyphonic motets, the musical experience on feast days could be incredibly rich and awe-inspiring. Visual arts also flourished. We've already discussed the illuminated manuscripts produced in the scriptorium, where scribes and artists collaborated to create books that were not just carriers of text but also exquisite objects of devotion. The vibrant colors, the intricate patterns, the delicate gold leaf, all spoke of a deep reverence for the words they adorned. Holding such a book, carefully turning its precious pages, would be a tactile and visual delight, a private encounter with sacred beauty. The monastery church itself was often a testament to artistic and architectural skill. From the soaring arches of Gothic cathedrals to the more austere, Romanesque beauty of earlier monastic churches, These buildings were designed to inspire awe and direct the mind towards God. Stained glass windows, if the monastery could afford them, would fill the interior with jewel-like light, depicting scenes from the Bible or the lives of saints, effectively illuminating the sacred space for a largely illiterate laity who might visit. Wall paintings, sculptures, and carved choir stalls could further enhance the beauty of the church, each element carefully chosen for its symbolic meaning and devotional power. Even the seemingly utilitarian parts of the monastery, like the cloister with its rhythmic arcades, or the chapter house with its vaulted ceiling, often displayed a high degree of craftsmanship and aesthetic sensibility. A quirky detail is that medieval masons and sculptors sometimes incorporated humorous or grotesque figures, gargoyles, for example, into church architecture, a playful counterpoint to the sacred themes, perhaps as a reminder of the chaos of the world outside or the ever-present reality of sin. Monasteries were also centers for the creation of liturgical objects and vestments. Skilled monks, or lay craftsmen employed by the monastery, would produce beautiful chalices, patens, reliquaries, and altar frontals, often made from precious metals like gold and silver, and adorned with gemstones or enamelwork. Vestments for the priests and choir, copes, chasubles, stoles, would be made from rich fabrics like silk or velvet, often heavily embroidered with sacred symbols. These objects were not mere decorations. They were seen as essential for the worthy celebration of the liturgy, tangible expressions of devotion and reverence. The skill and artistry involved in their creation were considerable. Historians still argue about the extent to which individual monks were encouraged or allowed to develop their personal artistic talents versus a more communal, anonymous approach to craftsmanship. While the names of some prominent monastic artists and architects are known, much of this work was likely undertaken without a strong emphasis on individual authorship, the focus being on the collective offering to God. The beauty found within the monastery wasn't about worldly ostentation, though some wealthier abbeys certainly accumulated impressive treasures that blurred this line. It was primarily about creating an environment conducive to prayer, contemplation, and the glorification of God. It was a beauty that was ordered, purposeful, and deeply imbued with spiritual meaning. For you, as a monk, to be surrounded by this carefully crafted harmony, the soaring chant, the glowing colors of a manuscript, the tranquil geometry of the cloister, was to live in a space where the divine seemed palpably present. This atmosphere of sacred artistry, far from being cold or distant, could be profoundly comforting and spiritually nourishing, a daily reminder that even in a harsh world, beauty and grace could flourish, creating a truly cozy haven for the soul. Presiding over this intricate world of prayer, work, art, and learning, and ensuring its surprisingly cozy and well-ordered functioning, was a figure of immense importance and considerable power, the abbot, or, in a nunnery, the abbess. This individual was not merely an administrator or a manager. They were the spiritual father, or mother, of the community, elected by the monks, usually for life, and entrusted with the ultimate responsibility for their well-being, both spiritual and temporal. While the image of an abbot might sometimes conjure up notions of stern authority, the ideal, as envisioned by Saint Benedict, was that of a wise, compassionate, and surprisingly pragmatic leader, a guiding hand that steered the monastic ship with both firmness and love. The election of an abbot was a serious affair. According to the rule of Saint Benedict, the abbot should be chosen by the whole community, or by the sounder part of it, a phrase that has generated much scholarly debate based on their wisdom, their holiness of life, and their ability to govern. He was not to be chosen based on seniority or worldly rank, but on merit. Once elected and consecrated, the abbot held considerable authority. He was responsible for upholding the rule, for the spiritual guidance of each monk, for the administration of the monastery's property and finances, and for representing the monastery to the outside world. His word was, in many respects, law within the monastery walls. Remember that vow of obedience you took? It was primarily to the rule, but also to the abbot as its interpreter and enforcer. However, this authority was not meant to be tyrannical. Saint Benedict repeatedly exhorts the abbot to be a gentle shepherd rather than a harsh disciplinarian, to temper justice with mercy, and to So arrange all things that the strong may have something to strive for, and the weak may not be discouraged. He was to be a teacher, a physician of souls, adapting his approach to the individual needs and temperaments of his monks. He was to consult with the community, especially the senior monks, on important matters, though the final decision rested with him. It's less like a medieval CO barking orders and more like a very experienced, very devout guidance counselor with ultimate veto power. The abbot's daily life would be a busy one, filled with a multitude of responsibilities. He would preside at liturgical services, preach to the community, hear confessions, or delegate this, and provide individual spiritual direction. He would oversee the various departments of the monastery, the scriptorium, the infirmary, the guest house, the kitchen, the workshops, the farms, ensuring that each was functioning smoothly and according to the rule. He would manage the monastery's often extensive estates and finances, dealing with tenants, overseeing agricultural production, and perhaps engaging in trade or legal disputes. Many abbots became skilled administrators and powerful figures in the wider secular world, sometimes acting as advisors to kings or nobles, or serving as feudal lords in their own right if the monastery held significant lands and privileges. Despite these worldly responsibilities, the abbot's primary role remained spiritual. He was to be a living example of the monastic ideal, a model of prayer, humility, and obedience to God. His personal piety and wisdom were crucial for setting the tone of the entire community. A good abbot could create an atmosphere of peace, harmony, and spiritual flourishing. A weak or worldly abbot, on the other hand, could lead to laxity, internal divisions, and a decline in monastic observance. A quirky, and very human, aspect of the abbot's role was dealing with the inevitable personal conflicts and failings that arose even within a community dedicated to holiness. Monks were still human, and there would be instances of grumbling, laziness, disobedience, or interpersonal friction. The abbot had to address these issues with a combination of firmness and compassion, applying discipline when necessary, which could range from private admonition to temporary exclusion from communal prayer or meals, or even, in extreme cases, expulsion, but always with the aim of correction and reconciliation rather than mere punishment. The rule provides detailed guidance on how to handle such difficult brethren. It's like being the principal, HR manager, and chief spiritual officer all rolled into one. The abbot typically had his own lodgings within the monastery, often slightly separate from the main monks' quarters, to allow him space for administrative work and for receiving important guests. However, he was still expected to participate in the communal life, eating with the monks in the refectory, though perhaps at a high table, and attending choir, as much as his other duties allowed. Historians still argue about the degree to which some abbots in wealthier or more powerful monasteries became detached from the everyday life of their communities, living in almost baronial splendor. While this certainly happened in some cases, especially in later periods or during times of monastic decline, the Benedictine ideal was always that the abbot should be first and foremost a monk among monks. For you, as an ordinary monk, the abbot was a figure of immense significance. He was your spiritual guide, your superior, the one to whom you had pledged your obedience. You would look to him for teaching, for counsel, and for an example of how to live the monastic life. A wise and caring abbot could be a source of great comfort and security, his leadership providing a steady anchor in your spiritual journey. His presence ensured that the surprisingly cozy and well-ordered world of the monastery was maintained, that the bells rang on time, that the bread was baked, that the sick were cared for, and that the work of God continued uninterrupted. He was the keystone in the arch of your monastic family, the surprisingly caring and pragmatic leader who held it all together. As you settle into the rhythms of monastic life, guided by the abbot's hand and supported by the community, you begin to appreciate not just the spiritual comforts, but also the remarkable practical efficiency and self-sufficiency of this world within walls. The medieval monastery wasn't just a place of prayer, it was a highly organized, largely independent economic and social unit, a miniature town capable of providing for almost all its own needs. This ability to function as a well-ordered, surprisingly cozy, and self-sustaining community was one of its greatest strengths and a source of profound stability in an often chaotic external world. Think about the sheer range of activities taking place within the monastic precinct or on its immediate estates. We've already touched upon many of them: the agricultural work in the fields and granges, producing grain, vegetables, and fruit; the animal husbandry, providing milk, meat, wool, and draft power; the kitchen, bakehouse, and brewhouse, transforming raw ingredients into daily sustenance. These alone formed the backbone of a largely self-sufficient food system. While some goods, like salt, iron for tools, or perhaps finer wines or spices for special occasions or wealthy guests, might need to be purchased from outside, the goal was to produce as much as possible in-house. Then there were the craft workshops. A monastery would typically have its own carpenters for making and repairing furniture, roofing, and other wooden structures, masons for maintaining the stone buildings, and a blacksmith for shoeing horses, making tools, and repairing ironwork. There might be a tannery for processing animal hides into leather, which could then be used by a cobbler to make shoes for the monks, or by a bookbinder in the scriptorium. Weavers and tailors within the community would produce and mend the woolen habits and linen undergarments worn by the monks. Remember that practical, comfortable habit? It was likely made right here. The scriptorium and library, as we've seen, made the monastery a center for producing and preserving its own intellectual and spiritual food, books. The infirmary, with its physic garden, provided healthcare for the community. The guest house catered to visitors. Even basic utilities were often managed internally. Many monasteries had sophisticated water management systems, with conduits or aqueducts bringing fresh water from springs, and well-designed drainage systems to carry away waste. This attention to water supply and sanitation, while not up to modern standards, was often far superior to what was found in contemporary secular towns and villages. Some monasteries even had dedicated bathhouses, a luxury in the medieval period, though bathing was perhaps not as frequent an activity as we might prefer today. Brother Cuthbert, is that your annual bath day I smell approaching? This high degree of self-sufficiency was not accidental. It was a deliberate aim, rooted in the desire for independence from the uncertainties and corrupting influences of the secular world. By providing for its own needs, the monastery could maintain its spiritual focus and its adherence to the rule without excessive reliance on external markets or patrons, though patronage was, of course, still very important for many foundations. It created a stable and predictable environment where the work of God could proceed with minimal disruption. The organization required to manage such a complex enterprise was considerable. Various obedientiaries, monks appointed by the abbot to oversee specific departments, would be responsible for the day-to-day running of these operations. There would be a cellarer, in charge of all food and drink supplies, a very powerful position, a sacrist, responsible for the church and its precious liturgical objects, an almoner, who distributed charity to the poor, a chamberlain, who looked after clothing and bedding, and so on. These obedientaries would manage budgets, supervise lay workers. Many monasteries employed lay staff for specialized tasks or heavy labor, and ensure that their departments ran efficiently. They were, in effect, the middle managers of this surprisingly complex monastic corporation. A quirky, and very important, aspect of this self-sufficiency was the monastery's role as a landowner. Many monasteries, through gifts and bequests over centuries, accumulated vast estates. They became significant feudal landlords, with tenants, villages, and sometimes even towns under their jurisdiction. Managing these lands, collecting rents, overseeing agricultural production on a large scale, and dealing with legal and economic matters related to their property, became a major preoccupation for some abbots and their officials. This could sometimes lead to tensions, as the spiritual ideals of the monastery occasionally clashed with the pragmatic, and sometimes harsh, realities of medieval land management. Historians still argue about whether the vast wealth and economic power accumulated by some monastic orders ultimately contributed to their spiritual decline or was a necessary means of sustaining their charitable and scholarly work in a challenging world. But for you, the individual monk living within this well-ordered system, the overwhelming feeling would likely be one of security and provision. You didn't have to worry about where your next meal was coming from, whether your roof would leak, or if you'd have clothes to wear. the community provided. Your work, whether in the fields, the scriptorium, or the kitchen, contributed directly to this collective well-being. There was a clear connection between your labor and its fruits. This self-contained world, with its predictable routines, its shared responsibilities, and its ability to meet almost all its own needs, was a remarkably cozy and stable place to live, especially when contrasted with the precariousness of life outside. It was a testament to human ingenuity, cooperation, and the power of a shared vision, all dedicated to creating an environment where the pursuit of the divine could flourish, sheltered from the storms of the secular world. It was, in many ways, a surprisingly complete and comforting little universe, all contained within those sturdy monastery walls. Life within the surprisingly cozy and self-sufficient world of the monastery was not an undifferentiated stream of prayer and work. Just like the world outside, it was marked by the turning of the seasons, each bringing its own particular tasks, moods, and even special moments of reprieve and celebration. This cyclical rhythm, tied to both the agricultural year and the liturgical calendar of the church, provided a deep sense of continuity and connection to the natural world, and punctuated the regular monastic routine with periods of particular solemnity, fasting, or even carefully circumscribed festivity, adding another layer of comforting predictability and shared experience to your cloistered life. The agricultural seasons profoundly shaped the pattern of manual labor. Spring, as we've seen, was a time of plowing, sowing, and the new growth in the physic and kitchen gardens. The air would be fresh with the scent of damp earth and blossoming fruit trees. There was a sense of renewal and hopeful activity. Summer brought long days filled with the tasks of weeding, tending the growing crops, and perhaps haymaking on the monastery's meadows. The sun would beat down, and the work could be strenuous, but the promise of the coming harvest was a powerful motivator. Autumn was dominated by the harvest itself, reaping grain, gathering fruits and vegetables, bringing in the bounty that would sustain the community through the winter. This was often a period of intense, communal effort, but also one of satisfaction and gratitude. Winter, then, was a quieter time in terms of outdoor work, a period for mending tools, indoor crafts, perhaps more time in the scriptorium, and for the land itself to rest. Each season had its own distinct character, its own challenges, and its own rewards, and you, as a monk engaged in labora, would be intimately attuned to these natural cycles. Interwoven with this agricultural rhythm was the even more dominant liturgical calendar of the church year. This calendar, with its recurring cycle of feasts and fasts, provided the overarching spiritual framework for monastic life. The year would begin with Advent, a period of penitential preparation leading up to Christmas. Then came Christmastide, a season of joyous celebration, marking the Nativity. This would be followed by Epiphany, and then the ordinary time, leading to Lent. Lent was a particularly solemn and austere period of 40 days of fasting, increased prayer, and penance, in preparation for Easter. The dietary rules would be stricter, perhaps with fewer meals or the exclusion of certain foods like eggs and dairy. The mood in the monastery would be more subdued, more focused on reflection and repentance. Then came the pinnacle of the Christian year, Easter, the celebration of Christ's resurrection. This was a time of great joy and feasting. The church would be specially decorated, the liturgy more elaborate, and the food in the refectory more plentiful and festive than usual. After the rigors of Lent, Easter was a welcome and spiritually uplifting reprieve. The Easter season would continue for 50 days, culminating in Pentecost, Whitsun, celebrating the descent of the Holy Spirit. The period after Pentecost, another stretch of ordinary time, would lead back towards Advent, completing the annual cycle. Beyond these major seasons, the calendar was punctuated by numerous saints' feast days and other special commemorations. Each monastery would have its own particular saints it honored, perhaps its patron saint or saints whose relics it possessed. These feast days would often involve special services in the church, perhaps more elaborate music, and sometimes a relaxation of the usual dietary rules or work routine. A quirky detail is that some monasteries had pittances, small extra allowances of food or drink, distributed on certain feast days, or gaudy days, from the Latin gaudium, joy, when there might be a more festive atmosphere. These provided welcome breaks in the regular routine and fostered a sense of communal celebration. It's like having a divinely sanctioned office party, but with more psalms and probably less embarrassing dancing. The changing seasons also affected the daily schedule and even the diet in practical ways. For example, during the summer months when the days were longer and agricultural work more demanding, the timing of meals and services might be adjusted slightly. The availability of fresh produce from the gardens and orchards would, of course, also vary with the seasons, influencing the dishes prepared in the kitchen. In winter, the diet would rely more on stored grains, root vegetables, and preserved foods. Historians still argue about the actual degree of festivity allowed in monasteries, especially in stricter orders. While the rule of Saint Benedict emphasizes moderation and warns against excessive feasting or levity, human nature and local customs often led to certain feast days being observed with a genuine sense of joy and communal celebration, within the bounds of monastic decorum. These moments of shared joy were important for morale and community cohesion. This interplay of seasonal and liturgical rhythms created a rich and varied tapestry for your monastic year. It was a life that was predictable yet not monotonous, structured yet not soulless. The regular toll of the bells for the daily office provided the constant beat, while the changing seasons and the unfolding drama of the church year provided the melody and harmony. There was a deep comfort in this cyclical recurrence, a sense that you were part of an ancient and enduring pattern, connected both to the earth beneath your feet and the heavens above. Whether you were shivering in the pre-dawn chill of a Lenten vigil, or enjoying a slightly richer pottage on a saint's day, you were held within a framework that was both timeless and ever-renewing, a surprisingly cozy and meaningful way to mark the passage of your days. While your daily life within the monastery revolves around prayer, work, and the comforting rhythms of the community, it's important to remember that this entire, surprisingly cozy enterprise didn't just float on a cloud of piety and good intentions. It required careful management, shrewd administration, and often, a surprising degree of economic acumen. Monasteries, especially the larger and older ones, were often significant landowners and economic powerhouses. The abbot and his appointed officials, the obedientiaries, weren't just spiritual leaders. They were also, in many respects, savvy managers, overseeing complex operations, dealing with lands and ledgers, and ensuring the financial stability that underpinned the monastery's spiritual and charitable work. We've touched on the monastery's aim for self-sufficiency, with its own farms, workshops, and gardens. But beyond producing for its own consumption, many monasteries also produced surpluses that could be sold or traded, generating income. For example, monasteries in regions known for wool production, like many Cistercian houses in England and Wales, became major players in the medieval wool trade, selling vast quantities of wool to merchants who would then export it to cloth-making centers in Flanders or Italy. This required careful management of sheep flocks, shearing operations, and negotiations with traders. It wasn't just Brother Cuthbert counting his sheep. It was a serious business. Similarly, monasteries with extensive vineyards, particularly in France, Germany, or Italy, became renowned producers of wine. Some monastic orders developed sophisticated winemaking techniques, and their wines were highly prized, both for liturgical use and for secular consumption. Think of famous wine regions today that still bear the names of ancient abbeys. Their reputation was built over centuries of monastic dedication to quality. This involved not just growing grapes, but also managing the vintage, cellaring, and sale of the wine. The cellarer monk, in charge of these operations, would need a good head for business as well as a discerning palate. Another excellent vintage, Brother Sommelier. This should fetch a good price at the bishop's table. Grain from monastic estates might also be sold, especially if the harvest was good. Monasteries often owned their own mills, and they might charge tenants or local peasants a fee for grinding their grain, providing another source of income. Timber from monastic woodlands, stone from monastery quarries, or even specialized craft items produced in their workshops, like fine metalwork or illuminated manuscripts, though the latter were more often for internal use or prestigious gifts, could also contribute to the monastery's coffers. Managing the monastery's lands was a huge undertaking. These estates, often acquired through donations and bequests over many generations, could be vast and scattered. The abbot, or a designated estate manager, often a senior monk or a trusted lay official, would be responsible for overseeing the cultivation of these lands, either directly through monastic granges farmed by monks or lay brothers, or indirectly through tenant farmers who paid rent in cash, kind, a portion of their produce, or labor services. This involved keeping detailed records, the ledgers of our title, tracking income and expenditure, resolving disputes with tenants, and ensuring the long-term productivity of the land. Many monasteries developed sophisticated systems of estate management, with written surveys, like customals and rentals, detailing their holdings and obligations. It was a complex administrative task, requiring literacy, numeracy, and a good understanding of agricultural practices and local laws. The income generated from these various sources was essential for maintaining the monastery. It paid for the upkeep of the buildings, which were often large and expensive to maintain, the purchase of goods that couldn't be produced in-house, like salt, iron, or certain spices, the support of the monks themselves, the provision of hospitality to guests, and the distribution of alms to the poor. A significant portion of monastic income was also dedicated to liturgical expenses, beeswax for candles, wine for mass, rich vestments, and the beautification of the church. Historians still argue about the overall economic efficiency and impact of monastic estates. Some scholars emphasize their role in agricultural innovation, land reclamation, and the development of more organized and productive farming practices. Others point to instances where monasteries could be conservative landlords, or where their wealth sometimes led to accusations of worldliness or a decline in spiritual fervor. The reality was likely complex and varied greatly depending on the specific order, the period, and the individual monastery. A quirky, but important, aspect of monastic finance was the system of obedientiary accounting. Each obedientiary, the cellarer, sacrist, infirmary, etc., was often responsible for managing the income and expenditure related to their specific department, keeping their own set of accounts. These would then be audited or reviewed by the abbot or a senior financial officer. This decentralized system, while sometimes complex, could also foster a sense of responsibility and careful stewardship among the officials. For you, as an ordinary monk, while you might not be directly involved in poring over ledgers or negotiating wool prices, unless you were one of the appointed officials, you would be aware of the monastery's economic life. Your labor in the fields or workshops contributed to it. The quality of the food in the refectory, the state of repair of the buildings, the ability of the monastery to provide for the sick and the poor, all these depended on the sound financial management of the institution. There was a certain cozy security in knowing that your community was well managed, its resources carefully husbanded, ensuring that this haven of prayer and work could continue to thrive, a stable and enduring presence in an often unstable world. The careful keeping of those lands and ledgers was, in its own way, just as vital as the chanting of the Psalms. As you live out your days within the well-ordered, surprisingly cozy, and economically stable world of the medieval monastery, it's crucial to remember the backdrop against which this haven existed, a wider secular society that was often anything but stable or cozy. The medieval period was frequently marked by political upheaval, warfare, famine, plague, and general lawlessness. In these stormy times, the monastery, with its thick stone walls, its disciplined community, and its spiritual authority, often stood as an island of enduring peace and a much sought-after sanctuary, not just for its own members, but sometimes for the beleaguered lay people living nearby. Imagine the fear that would grip a region when rival lords went to war, their armies pillaging the countryside, burning villages, and terrorizing the peasantry. Or picture the despair during a time of famine, when crops failed and starvation stalked the land. Or consider the sheer terror of an outbreak of plague, like the Black Death in the mid-14th century, which could decimate populations with horrifying speed. The medieval world was, for many, a place of profound insecurity, where life could be brutal and short. Remember that. You probably wouldn't survive this. Reality check from our introduction? It wasn't an exaggeration for vast swathes of the population. In such times of crisis, monasteries often became places of refuge. Their status as sacred ground, dedicated to God, sometimes offered a degree of protection from the worst excesses of warfare. While not entirely immune to attack or plunder, Viking raids on monasteries in earlier centuries were notorious, and even later, armies weren't always respectful of ecclesiastical property. Monasteries were generally considered less legitimate targets than secular settlements. Their thick walls, originally built more for demarcation and enclosure than for military defense, could also provide a measure of physical security. Desperate peasants might flee to the nearest abbey or priory, hoping to find safety within its gates until the immediate danger passed. The guest house, already accustomed to receiving travelers, might find itself overflowing with refugees. Beyond physical protection, monasteries offered spiritual sanctuary. In a world where divine judgment and the threat of damnation were keenly felt, the constant prayer and intercession of the monastic community were seen as a powerful spiritual shield. People believed that the monks, through their dedicated life of prayer, could appeal to God for mercy, for an end to plague or famine, or for protection from their enemies. Wealthy patrons often endowed monasteries specifically with the expectation that the monks would pray for their souls and the souls of their family members, both in this life and after death. This intercessory role gave monasteries a profound spiritual authority and made them vital institutions in the eyes of the lay community. Monasteries also acted as centers of charity and relief in times of hardship. The almoner, as we've mentioned, was responsible for distributing food, clothing, and sometimes even money to the poor and needy from the surrounding area. During a famine, the monastery's well-stocked granaries, thanks to its efficient agriculture and estate management, might be the only source of food for starving villagers. The infirmary might offer care to the sick and dying, even if its resources were overwhelmed during a major epidemic. This charitable outreach, while sometimes limited by the monastery's own needs and resources, was a crucial aspect of its social role and reinforced its image as a place of compassion and sanctuary. A quirky, and sometimes contentious, aspect of monastic sanctuary was its occasional use by individuals fleeing secular justice. While church sanctuary laws were complex and varied by region and period, the idea that a fugitive could find temporary, or sometimes even permanent, protection by taking refuge within the consecrated precincts of a church or monastery did exist. This could lead to conflicts between ecclesiastical and secular authorities, but it underscored the monastery's perceived status as a place apart, governed by a higher law. The stability and continuity offered by monastic life were also a powerful draw. In a world where dynasties rose and fell, and where political allegiances could shift like sand, monasteries often represented centuries of unbroken tradition and institutional memory. The abbot might change, monks would come and go, but the monastery itself, with its rule, its liturgy, and its deep connection to the past, endured. This sense of permanence, of being part of something ancient and unchanging, was incredibly appealing in an age of flux. It was a spiritual and psychological anchor. Historians still argue about the extent to which monasteries were truly isolated from the storms of the outside world. While they aimed for a degree of separation, they were also deeply embedded in the social, economic, and political fabric of their regions. They owned land, interacted with tenants and merchants, and were often subject to the pressures and patronage of powerful secular lords. However, compared to the vulnerability of an individual peasant family or a small, undefended village, the monastery offered a significantly higher degree of security, order, and resilience. So, as you look out from the high window of the library, perhaps, or from the bell tower, and see the smoke of a distant raid, or hear tales of hardship from a newly arrived guest, you feel a profound sense of gratitude for the thick stone walls that surround you, for the well-ordered community that sustains you, and for the spiritual disciplines that give your life meaning. This monastery is not just a collection of buildings, it's a fortress against chaos, a storehouse of both material and spiritual sustenance, and a surprisingly cozy and enduring haven in a world that often offered little of either. It is, quite literally, a sanctuary in stormy times, a testament to the enduring human quest for peace, order, and a connection to something larger than oneself. The bells of the monastery, which have marked the rhythm of your days and years, now begin to toll a more contemplative, perhaps even a slightly melancholic, note as we reflect on the enduring legacy of this surprisingly cozy and profoundly influential way of life. The medieval monastery, as we've explored it, from the hesitant steps of the novice to the quiet wisdom of the abbot, from the fragrant peace of the cloister garden to the focused industry of the scriptorium, was far more than just a collection of stone buildings and robed figures. It was a vibrant, complex, and remarkably resilient institution that left an indelible mark on the spiritual, intellectual, economic, and even the physical landscape of Europe, a legacy of light and enduring peace whose echoes can still be felt today. As your own time within these imagined walls draws to a close, you can look back on a life that, while demanding, was also filled with a unique sense of purpose and belonging. You found sanctuary from a harsh world, yes, but you also found a structured, supportive community, a rhythm of prayer and work that nourished both body and soul. You experienced the quiet comfort of the habit, the spiritual liberation of the vows, and the profound peace that came from a life dedicated to something larger than yourself. Remember the taste of freshly baked monastic bread, the scent of beeswax and old parchment in the library, the sound of voices raised in ancient chant, the warmth of shared labor in the fields. These are the sensory details of a life that, for all its medieval austerity, possessed a deep and surprising coziness. The most obvious legacy of medieval monasticism is, of course, spiritual and religious. Monasteries were powerhouses of prayer, centers of Christian devotion that shaped the religious landscape of Europe for centuries. They preserved and propagated the Christian faith, provided pastoral care, in some instances, and offered a model of dedicated spiritual life that inspired countless individuals. The great monastic orders, Benedictines, Cistercians, Carthusians, and others, each contributed their unique charism and emphasis, creating a rich tapestry of Christian expression. Their influence on liturgy, theology, and popular piety was immense. Intellectually, the legacy is equally profound. As we saw in the scriptorium and library, monasteries were the primary guardians and transmitters of classical and early Christian learning throughout much of the Middle Ages. Without the painstaking work of monastic scribes, countless texts that formed the bedrock of Western civilization would have been lost. They didn't just copy, they also studied, commented upon, and in some cases, added to this body of knowledge. Many monasteries ran schools, providing education not just for their own novices but sometimes for the sons of local nobles or promising scholars, laying some of the groundwork for the later development of universities. Economically and agriculturally, monasteries were often pioneers of land management, agricultural innovation, and certain industries like wool production or winemaking. Their well-organized estates and their emphasis on efficient labor contributed significantly to the medieval economy in many regions. They cleared forests, drained marshes, and introduced new farming techniques, literally shaping the physical landscape. Remember those prosperous monastic granges? They were a testament to this practical ingenuity. Socially, monasteries provided charity, hospitality, and healthcare. The almonry, the guest house, and the infirmary were vital institutions that offered relief and succor to the poor, the traveler, and the sick, embodying the Christian ideal of compassion in action. They were stable points in an often unstable society, offering a degree of order and continuity. Artistically and architecturally, the legacy is visible all around us, even today. The great monastic churches and abbey ruins that still dot the European landscape are testaments to the skill of medieval builders and craftsmen. The traditions of Gregorian chant, manuscript illumination, and liturgical art that flourished in monasteries have profoundly influenced Western art and music. That sense of heavenly harmony we discussed wasn't just a fleeting experience. It was captured in enduring forms. A quirky, but telling, aspect of their enduring legacy is found in place names. How many towns, villages, or even streets still bear names like Abbeywood, Monckton, Priorsdean, or are named after saints particularly associated with monastic orders? These names are quiet reminders of the deep historical presence of these communities. Of course, the history of medieval monasticism is not without its shadows. There were periods of decline, instances of corruption or worldliness, and criticisms, especially during the Reformation, of their wealth and power. Historians still argue about the balance between the ideal and the reality of monastic life throughout its long history. But even acknowledging these complexities, the overall contribution remains immense. As the world outside the monastery walls changed, with the rise of universities, the growth of cities, the invention of the printing press, and eventually the religious upheavals of the Reformation, the role of monasteries began to shift. Many were suppressed, their lands confiscated, their communities dispersed. Yet, the monastic ideal itself did not die. It adapted, transformed, and continues to exist today, still offering a path of dedicated spiritual life for those who seek it. The surprising coziness we've explored, the warmth of community, the comfort of routine, the security of provision, the peace of contemplation, the satisfaction of purposeful work, these were not accidental byproducts. They were integral to a way of life designed to foster spiritual growth and service to God. And the light that was kindled and tended within those ancient walls, the light of faith, of learning, of charity, of beauty, was a legacy that shone far beyond the cloister, helping to illuminate a path through the often dark centuries of the Middle Ages, and leaving an enduring glow that still warms us today. The peace of the monastery, in its best moments, was indeed a foretaste of a deeper, more lasting peace. And so, as the great oak doors of the medieval monastery gently close behind us, and the sound of the distant bells fades into the soft stillness of your room, may you carry with you a sense of the profound and surprisingly comforting peace that lay at the heart of that ancient way of life. The world of disciplined prayer, shared labor, and quiet contemplation can now recede, leaving you with a warmth that lingers, like the scent of beeswax and old parchment. Allow the rhythmic security of the monastic day, the gentle order that we've explored, to soothe your own mind. Let go of the complexities and demands of your modern world, just for these few moments, and embrace the simplicity and serenity that our journey has offered. Imagine the soft glow of candlelight in a quiet scriptorium, the gentle rustle of leaves in a cloister garden, the unified voices raised in timeless chant. These are images of peace, of a sanctuary found not just in stone walls, but in a shared purpose and a deep connection to something timeless. As you drift towards sleep, may you find your own inner cloister, a place of quiet refuge and gentle repose. May the steady, comforting rhythm of your own breath be like the tolling of those ancient bells, lulling you into a deep and restorative slumber. The journey is complete, the story told. Now there is only the peace of the present moment, and the promise of a tranquil night.